I used to think the most painful thing in my family was being treated like the one who was always expected to endure. But one phone call made me realize the truth was far crueler. My parents had secretly sold my apartment to pay for my sister's dream wedding, while she had quietly stolen credit for my sacrifice for years. And this time, I decided I would not stay silent. My name is April Barrett. And the year I turned 32 was the year I finally understood that in my family, I had never really been treated like a daughter with the right to speak up. Everything began to fall apart with what should have been an ordinary phone call. At that moment, I was still at work, still believing that even if my life felt lonely, at least I had the stability I had worked so hard to build. Then my mother called, sounding strangely cheerful, almost as if she was about to share wonderful news. But what she said made my whole body go cold. My parents were thanking me for the wedding gift I had supposedly given Megan. I had no idea what she meant until she casually explained that they had sold my apartment. The apartment I had bought with 8 years of hard work. The apartment I had never agreed to sell. The apartment they had turned into cash for Megan's $100,000 dream wedding. What hurt was not only that they took my property as if they had every right to do it. What hurt even more was the way they laughed. The way they spoke as if I should feel honored to contribute to Megan's happiness. In that moment, I realized this was no longer simple carelessness. It was betrayal. And it had not started that day. If I have to explain how something like that could happen, I have to go back to my childhood. In our house, Megan was always the child everyone revolved around. And I was the one expected to adjust. She was 4 years younger than me. Bright, charming, and naturally good at making people soften around her. I, on the other hand, was labeled the strong one from an early age. It sounds like praise. But in my family, it only meant I would never be the priority. When both of us wanted to learn piano, my mother signed Megan up for private lessons with a neighborhood teacher. I was told I was old enough to teach myself online. I remember standing there, watching my sister head off with brand new sheet music, while I sat down at an old keyboard and tried to learn by myself. No one asked how I felt. No one noticed the disappointment sitting inside me. Little by little, I understood that in that house, my needs would always come second to Megan's feelings. She was protected, and I was expected to mature. She was comforted, and I was reminded to be understanding. I grew up with the same lesson repeated over and over. If I spoke up, I was selfish. If I stayed quiet, life stayed easier for everyone else except me. That favoritism was never an isolated thing. It became the pattern of my entire childhood. When I wanted to join the school choir, my parents said we could not afford the uniform. I believed them. 2 months later, Megan had an expensive costume for her dance recital. Every time something like that happened, I swallowed the hurt and told myself not to make trouble. I complained once. Just once. And my father looked at me with disappointment and told me Megan was more sensitive, that she needed more support, and that I was the strong one. I hated that phrase. It turned every act of unfairness into something reasonable in their minds. So I learned not to ask, not to demand, not to expect. I taught myself how to work harder, how to be tougher, how to need less, and somewhere in all of that, I built a quiet belief that my role in the family was not to be loved equally, but to stand in the background so Megan could shine. Every time I tried to step into the light, someone pushed me back with words like, "Don't be petty. Don't make things harder. Or think about your sister." They trained me to tolerate so much that eventually they came to believe I would accept anything, even when it meant losing what was mine. I used to hope things would be different when I grew up. Instead, the gap only became more obvious. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. That should have been one of the proudest days of my life. My parents were not there. They had forgotten to book their flights because they were too busy helping Megan move into a new apartment they had co-signed for. I walked across that stage alone, received my diploma alone, and took pictures with my roommate's parents instead of my own. I told myself I should be used to it. But that ache never really disappeared. Years later, when I called to say I had finally bought my own apartment with money I earned myself, my father's first reaction was not pride. He asked whether the place had a spare room in case Megan needed somewhere to stay for a few months. I laughed it off at the time. But deep down I understood something painful. Even my biggest accomplishment only mattered to them if it could somehow benefit Megan. My mother always said I was so independent. For years I tried to hear that as praise. In truth, it only meant they did not have to try with me. I would manage. I would survive. And because I always survived, they gave themselves permission to act as if my feelings never required any care. I worked relentlessly for 8 years to buy that apartment. No co-signer. No family money. No head start beyond discipline. Exhaustion. And the refusal to give up. I saved through packed lunches, skipped trips, late nights, and constant self-denial. The day I got the keys, I thought maybe, for once, I could be proud of myself without needing anyone else's approval. But even that joy was shaded by the way my parents saw everything through Megan. When they asked if they could keep my apartment documents in their lockbox for safety, I agreed almost immediately. Whatever else they were still my parents. I never imagined that trust would become the weapon used against me. At that point, I was still the person who wanted to keep the peace, who still believed that even if my family was flawed, they were not capable of this level of cruelty. I was wrong. And maybe I had been wrong for a very long time. If you have ever been the person who quietly carried the hard part for your family, the one who thought silence would preserve peace, then come on. I know that feeling better than I ever wanted to. Because that silence is exactly what taught them to treat me like something they were entitled to use. Handing my apartment documents over to my parents was one of those decisions I look back on with a mix of anger and grief. But at the time, I truly did not suspect anything. I had learned how to protect myself out in the world. But somehow I never learned to protect myself inside my own family. I thought that even if they favored Megan, even if they always placed her first, there had to be a line they would never cross. I believed they would never betray me in a way that involved the law, forged paperwork, and the sale of my home. I misjudged them completely. When I gave my mother those papers, I even felt relieved. I thought important documents were safer in my parents' lockbox than sitting alone in my apartment. I had no idea that in their minds, my property had already stopped being fully mine. They saw it as a family asset, and in their twisted logic, if Megan needed something, then what belonged to me could be used. What hurts most is that I made it easy for them, not because I was foolish, but because I still had trust left in me. People think betrayal only cuts deeply when the other person was cruel from the start. That is not true. The deepest betrayal comes from people you kept trying to love, trying to understand, and trying to believe in, even while they kept proving you were never their priority. 3 years before Megan's wedding, my parents fell into serious financial trouble. My father had always liked to imagine himself as some kind of businessman, and he poured nearly everything they had into an Arizona real estate development pitched by an old friend. It collapsed within months. The people behind it disappeared, and my parents were left with a mortgage they could not keep up with and a foreclosure notice hanging over them. I found out by accident when a final warning letter from the bank was sent to my address by mistake. I still remember the feeling in my chest when I read it. I did not hesitate. That same afternoon, I called the bank and arranged for automatic payments from my account. Every month, more than $2,000 quietly left my life to keep my parents from losing their home. I never told them. Part of me did not want them to feel ashamed. Part of me knew that if I brought it up, the conversation would turn messy, full of promises and excuses. And I would somehow end up as the difficult one. So, I handled it the way I always handled everything, quietly. I did what needed to be done so other people could stay comfortable. I had no idea that my private act of loyalty would become the very thing someone else would steal and use to build herself a halo. For 4 years, I made those mortgage payments. 48 transfers. 48 months of quietly carrying a burden that was never supposed to be mine. I never saw it as some grand sacrifice. At the time, it just felt like something that had to be done. I did not want my parents to lose their house. I did not want them to face humiliation, panic, or ruin. Every time the payment confirmation appeared in my inbox, I would sigh and move on with my day. I kept working. I kept cutting down my own spending. I kept pushing off the things I wanted so I could make sure the next payment would always clear. I thought the only comfort in all of that was knowing that I was doing the right thing. But apparently even that did not belong to me. During those years, I had no idea that Megan had seen one of my payment confirmations when she borrowed my laptop for work. She knew everything. The amount. The source. The fact that I was the one keeping our parents afloat. And instead of telling the truth, she stepped into a role my silence had accidentally created. With one well-placed lie, Megan turned my sacrifice into a story that made her look noble. Meanwhile, I stayed in the shadows, never realizing that the credit for my endurance was already being handed to someone else. I only discovered the truth later. But once I did, everything suddenly made sense. My parents genuinely believed Megan was the one paying their mortgage. They thought she was sacrificing her own modest PR salary every month out of pure love for them. They were proud of her. They told neighbors, people at church, anyone who would listen, that their youngest daughter was so generous and devoted. And all the while, I kept making the payments, still thinking that at least I was helping them survive. Never realizing someone else was standing in the spotlight, collecting the gratitude meant for me. What hurt most was not just the lie itself, but the ease with which Megan sustained it. Every time our mother praised her, every time our father thanked her, she chose silence. Not once. Not by accident. Not because of some misunderstanding. It was a deliberate choice repeated month after month for 4 years. And later, that lie became the foundation for everything else. My parents believed Megan had already sacrificed so much for them that she deserved the wedding of her dreams. In their minds, they were simply finding another way to support the daughter who had given so much. That is what made it possible for them to target my apartment without guilt. Their theft of my home rested on a falsehood Megan knew was false from the very beginning. Everything escalated when Megan got engaged to Brandon Whitmore. The first time I met him, I could see my parents changing right in front of me. Brandon was polished, polite, wealthy, and from exactly the kind of family my parents had always admired from a distance. The Whitmores had money, social standing, influence, and the kind of name that made people straighten their posture. In my parents' eyes, this marriage was not just about Megan's happiness. It was a chance to elevate the entire Barrett family. They began planning the wedding like it was some grand investment in their future. Not a warm, intimate event, but an extravagant spectacle with a country club ballroom, imported flowers, an orchestra, and hundreds of guests. The cost climbed to $100,000, money they simply did not have. And because they believed Megan had been carrying the mortgage for years, they convinced themselves she should be spared any financial burden for her big day. I stood on the outside watching all of this happen, still unaware that my apartment had already become part of their solution. If you are still with me this far into the story, hit like, because the deeper this went, the more I realized that some families do not destroy you with shouting. They destroy you through years of quiet entitlement. I had no idea that while I was going to work and living my life in the apartment I had built through sheer discipline, my mother was looking up its value online. My parents ran the numbers, imagined what it could bring in, and slowly convinced themselves that selling it made sense. In their minds, Megan had already given so much by paying their mortgage. So now the family had to repay her with a wedding worthy of the Whitmores. And if I was the independent one, the capable one, the one who always landed on her feet, then taking my apartment was just a practical adjustment. They never paused to ask what I wanted. Because deep down, they were sure I would not resist. They had lived too long with the version of April who swallowed anger for the sake of peace. The truth is, their entire plan was built not just on greed or favoritism, but on the conviction that I had no boundaries. I was not simply the less-loved daughter. I had become a family resource they believed they could access whenever Megan needed something. And once I saw that clearly, something inside me went cold. Cold enough that the old kind of hurt started changing into clarity. I could finally see what I had been to them for years: useful, dependable, and entirely too easy to take for granted. To other people, my apartment might have looked like just another piece of property. To me, it was proof that my life meant something. Every wall held the evidence of years spent working 60-hour weeks, skipping pleasures, delaying my own comfort, and surviving the ache of being overlooked in my own family. I still remembered the soft green paint I chose for the bedroom, the couch I saved for half a year to buy, the bay window overlooking the park that made mornings feel a little gentler. It was the first place in my life that belonged completely to me. Not a borrowed room. Not a temporary arrangement. Not something available if Megan needed it for a few months. It was the only space that ever made me feel fully real. So when I thought about my parents treating it like an asset they could cash out, I was not just afraid of losing property. I was afraid of losing the last physical proof that my effort mattered. If I stayed silent, I would not only lose my home, I would lose the final piece of self-respect I still had. And I think it was on the night I understood that. Really understood it. That I made the first true decision of my life. I was not going to keep being the person everyone could take from without consequence. That phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I can still remember seeing my mother's name on my screen with no warning at all about what I was about to hear. She was laughing from the moment she started speaking. And I could hear my father laughing in the background too. She said they were calling to thank me for my wedding gift to Megan. I had no idea what she meant. Then she explained, in the most casual tone imaginable, that they had sold my apartment, gotten a great price, and found a cash buyer. Wonderful news. According to her, the room seemed to tilt. I said I had never agreed to that. My father cut in with a voice full of irritation and superiority, telling me not to be dramatic. It was only an apartment. Family shares? My mother followed with that patient, condescending tone she always used when she wanted to make me feel unreasonable. What is yours is ours, she said. And besides, I was so capable that I would find another place. Capable. That word had never really meant strong in our family. It meant expendable. I asked how they had managed it when I had never signed anything. My father cleared his throat and said they had handled the paperwork. I understood immediately. They had forged my signature. They had broken the law. But what chilled me most was that they saw absolutely nothing wrong with it. They were still laughing. Still assuming I would swallow it. I hung up without saying goodbye. For the first time, I did not cry. I only felt a cold, steady rage rising inside me. The first person I called was Claire Donovan, my best friend since college and one of the sharpest real estate attorneys I knew. I told her everything while my hands were still shaking. She listened to the whole story and then told me to give her an hour. 47 minutes later, she called back. The first piece of news was enough to let me breathe. The sale had not been finalized. A purchase agreement had been signed. But the title company had flagged inconsistencies in the signature and refused to complete the closing. In other words, the deal was not legally complete. I felt relief for a single moment. And then my anger came back even harder. Claire did not soften the truth. She said plainly that this was fraud and forgery. Enough for me to press criminal charges if I chose to. I sat there, stunned by the word criminal attached to my own parents. But then she added something else that made the blood in my body seem to freeze. My mother had apparently been bragging at the grocery store that Megan had been paying their mortgage for years. I told Claire that was impossible. I was the one making those payments. She asked if I was sure. And I almost laughed at how absurd the question felt. I had statements, emails, account numbers, everything. Claire was silent for a few seconds before saying the thing I was not ready to hear Megan had not just known. Megan had been taking credit for my sacrifice for 4 years. That evening, I drove to my parents' house without really remembering the drive itself. I had not called ahead. I had not prepared some speech. I just needed to look them in the eye. My mother answered the door with a pleasant little smile. And inside, my father was sitting in the kitchen surrounded by wedding invoices. I asked a very simple question. Why had they not asked me before trying to sell my apartment? My father brushed it aside immediately, acting as if I was causing trouble at an inconvenient moment. He said the wedding was only 3 weeks away and that I should not make things harder. I sat down, forced my voice to stay calm, and asked a second question. How exactly had Megan managed to pay more than $2,000 a month on her salary? My mother lit up instantly with pride. She said Megan had been wonderful. So generous. So steady. Then Megan walked in. She heard what we were talking about and, without hesitation, confirmed the lie. She looked directly at me and said that helping family was just what people did. That was the moment I understood something even deeper she knew I knew. And she still did not care. No shame. No fear. She even sounded irritated. Asking why. For once, something could not just be about her. I stood up and left. Not because I had lost, but because I realized there was no point trying to reason with people who had built their comfort on my silence. From that moment on, I stopped trying to persuade anyone. I only wanted the truth exposed. After that confrontation, I gave up any fantasy that this could be handled with one heartfelt family conversation. Claire helped me spread every piece of evidence across her conference table. 4 years of bank statements. 48 payments. Every one of them made, from my account to the bank holding my parents' mortgage. Looking at that stack of paper made my throat tighten. More than $100,000. Almost the same amount they were about to burn on Megan's wedding. Claire also looked into Megan's salary and confirmed what I already knew. There was no realistic way Megan could have paid that amount month after month and still lived normally. What hurt me most was not the number itself, but the way she had used my proof to construct her own image. She saw one payment confirmation on my laptop, remembered the amount, and built a whole story from it. Every thank you, every proud smile, every word of admiration directed at Megan had been bought with my money. I picked up one of the statements and stared at my own name printed across it. For the first time, I let myself feel anger without apology. Not the kind of anger I immediately softened with understanding. Real anger. Anger at being robbed not only of property but of recognition. Anger at being treated like someone who would never push back. And out of that anger, I began preparing the first real response of my life. Claire and I kept digging, and what we found made the whole thing even clearer. I searched through old emails from my parents and found exactly what I needed. Messages where my mother promised they were only keeping my apartment papers safe. That they would never do anything without asking me first. My father had written similar things. I printed them all. Then Claire sent me a screenshot from a family group chat she still had access to because my mother had forgotten to remove her years earlier. The message was from Megan, sent right after my parents decided to sell my apartment. It was short and chillingly confident. Don't worry about April's apartment. She won't make a fuss. She never does. I read those words over and over, until something inside me broke clean in half. Megan had not just stolen credit for my sacrifice. She had actively reassured our parents that I would continue playing my old role, that I would stay quiet, absorb the damage, and keep the peace. She understood exactly how I had been trained by this family. And she used that knowledge against me. That message was more than evidence. It was the summary of my entire life in the Barrett family. They had all become so comfortable depending on my silence that they mistook it for permission. I added the screenshot to the folder. And for the first time, my plan became crystal clear. I was not only going to save my apartment, I was going to end the role they had assigned me for 32 years. Claire laid out 3 possible paths. 1. Go to the police immediately and let the law handle the forgery. 2. Wait until after the wedding and address it privately. 3. Expose everything publicly at the wedding before Megan could secure her place inside the Whitmore family, and before anyone could turn me into the jealous sister trying to ruin her big day. I sat with those choices for a long time. Reporting it right away could lead to real criminal consequences for my parents. Waiting until after the wedding felt like surrender. By then, Megan would be protected. And I would be easy to paint as bitter and unstable. The longer I thought about it, the more obvious it became that there was only one moment when the truth would be impossible to twist in front of everyone. While my parents were still presenting Megan as selfless and our family as honorable, I called the man who had agreed to buy my apartment and explained everything: the forged signature, the fraud, the fact that I had never consented to the sale. A few days later, he withdrew completely. The deposit was returned, and the transaction was void. My parents had no idea. They kept pouring money and energy into the wedding, still believing their miracle funding was on its way. Meanwhile, I placed every piece of evidence into a plain brown folder and waited for the wedding day. I did not feel like I was trying to destroy them. I felt like, for the first time in my life, I was refusing to let someone else tell my story for me. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up in my apartment with a strange sense of calm. I put on the bridesmaid dress Megan had chosen for me, a washed-out pink that made me disappear, and tucked the evidence folder into my bag. At the country club, everything was as lavish as my parents had dreamed. 200 guests, white flowers everywhere, an orchestra, chandeliers, upper-class handshakes and polished smiles from a family who had no idea their performance was about to collapse. I watched my mother tell Mrs. Whitmore that both of her daughters were so selfless. She even bragged that Megan had been financially supporting the family for years. I gripped the strap of my purse and said nothing, waiting for the right moment. At the reception, my father stood up to give a toast. He thanked Megan for paying the mortgage and thanked me for giving my apartment so my sister could have the wedding of her dreams. The whole room applauded. Megan dipped her head gracefully, accepting praise she had not earned. And when 200 eyes turned toward me, expecting the usual obedient smile, I stood up and asked for the microphone. The moment I held it in my hand, I knew I was not turning back. I said I had a few things I wanted to clarify about the sacrifices just mentioned. The room fell silent. Megan went pale, and I reached into my purse, pulled out the folder, and prepared to tell the truth in front of everyone. I spoke clearly. I said I had not sold my apartment, and I had never agreed to give it to Megan. My parents had forged my signature in an attempt to sell property that belonged solely to me. Then I held up the deed, the canceled contract, and the documentation proving the transaction had been voided. I looked directly at the Whitmores and said the buyer had backed out because the deal was fraudulent. The room began to stir, and my parents turned white. But I was not finished. I went on to explain that for the past 4 years, I, not Megan, had been paying my parents' mortgage. I lifted the bank statements one by one, each bearing my name, each documenting the truth. Then I turned to Megan and said she had known all along, but had still chosen to accept every word of praise and gratitude as if it belonged to her. Brandon stood up and stared at her like he was seeing a stranger. "Mr. Whitmore asked to see the folder." And the moment I watched him read through those pages, I knew Megan's perfect image was over. I announced that as of that day, I would no longer make another mortgage payment for my parents. I had loved them enough to save their home in secret for 4 years. But they had not loved me enough to ask before trying to take mine. When I finished, I set down the microphone and walked out. In the days that followed, Megan's marriage collapsed. My family's reputation shattered. My parents lost their house. And I remained in my apartment. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the daughter who could be used without consequence. I was simply myself. If you have ever been the one who sacrificed in silence, the one who was overlooked, used, or robbed of credit, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And don't forget to share the boundary you will never let anyone cross again.